Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine or have a sense that something isn't quite right? In this channel, we dive deep into the realm of the mysterious and the unknown. From chilling encounters with cryptids to baffling events that defy logic, we explore the stories that will make you completely question your own reality. So settle in, buckle up, and get yourself cozy, because the journey into the unknown begins now. Ethan had been itching to get off his couch. He'd gotten into a routine of just sitting around and wanted to break it. He decided he needed to get out of the Columbus area and into nature. He'd heard good things from friends at work about the Shawnee State Forest, a sprawling wilderness in southern Ohio known for its rugged hills and dense woods. It was about a 2-hour drive, but he didn't mind and actually looked forward to the drive. The forest was one of the largest in Ohio, offering miles of trails and the sense of isolation he craved. Ethan planned the trip for mid-September. He packed his tent, sleeping bag, and just enough food to last the weekend. He had a simple itinerary: hike, camp, and go offline and away from everything for a few days. The drive down was uneventful, and he reached the park around midday. The weather was cold but clear, perfect for hiking. Shawnee was quiet this time of year. Most visitors preferred the spring or summer, so Ethan had the trails mostly to himself. He set out along a suggested trail that wound through thick groves of oak and hickory. It felt good to breathe the fresh air, hear nothing but the crunch of his boots, and see nothing but the occasional deer darting through the woods. After several hours of hiking, he reached a small clearing near a ridge where he decided to set up camp. From here, he could see the rolling hills stretch out beneath him with trees as far as the eye could see. Ethan got a fire going and cooked a small meal as the sun began to set. The forest around him was quiet, but he wasn't as seasoned as some and didn't realize that was strange. Until after what happened. By the time he zipped up his tent and climbed into his sleeping bag, it was pitch black outside. He lay there, staring up at the fabric of his tent, feeling the kind of calm that only comes from being completely alone in nature. But as he started to drift off to sleep, a distant sound pulled him back to full alertness. A howl. At first, Ethan was sure it was a coyote. He'd heard them before, and they weren't uncommon in Ohio. It made him a bit nervous, but he talked himself through it, telling himself that coyote don't want anything to do with humans. Still, the sound put him on edge. It echoed through the forest, and it seemed to hang in the air long after the sound faded. Ethan sat up, his heart beating a little faster. He listened closely, waiting to hear it again. Minutes passed, and just as he was about to brush it off, the howl came again. Terrifyingly, it was louder this time, closer. It sounded unnatural, almost distorted. Ethan grabbed his mace and put on his headlamp, unzipped the tent, and peered out into the darkness. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. Of course, that just made things even worse. He climbed back into his tent, trying to convince himself all was okay by working through logic. Maybe a sick coyote, maybe even a dog, though he hadn't seen any signs of people for miles. But the unease stayed with him, gnawing at the back of his mind as he lay there, listening and waiting. Then, around midnight, the howling started again. They were close, far too close for comfort. And now all logic was leaving quickly, and he was having a hard time holding it together. Ethan again stepped outside the tent. The moon was now shining low around the campsite, and as soon as his feet hit the earth, the howls stopped suddenly, leaving the forest in complete silence. Ethan stood there, listening intently, but the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. He knew for certain that something wasn't right. He had camped in plenty of forests before, but this was very different. He even noticed that the air felt heavier. Trying to calm his nerves, Ethan stoked the fire and sat down by the flames, staring into the woods, trying to act like all was normal. But his mind was nothing but normal. Was it wolves? but he didn't think there were any in Ohio, not anymore. Wild dogs? Unlikely, to say the least. Whatever was making those noises, it didn't sound like anything that should be there. Eventually, Ethan tried again to sleep, but he lay in his tent, listening, waiting. The silence grew to be oppressive. His thoughts kept drifting back to the sounds. Around 4 a.m., the howls returned. This time, Ethan could feel the vibrations in his chest. He sat bolt upright in his sleeping bag, adrenaline flooding his system. Whatever was making those noises was close, too close. He unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air once again. The fire had burned out completely by now. The howls seemed to come from all around him, echoing through the trees in every direction. Ethan's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he scanned the woods, looking for any sign of movement. That's when he saw it, just at the edge of the clearing, a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting in the beam of his flashlight. They were low to the ground at first, like those of a crouching animal, but as Ethan watched, they slowly rose, higher and higher, until they were above eye level, taller than a person, by a foot or two. It was hard to make out the figure in the darkness, but he was sure it had broad shoulders and a hunched back. The eyes continued to glow, unblinking as it stared directly at him. The howling stopped, replaced again by that low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. He stood frozen as the figure took a step toward him. That's when Ethan snapped out of his paralysis. He didn't bother packing up his tent or grabbing his gear. He just screamed at the top of his lungs and then ran. He bolted through the woods, branches and thorns snagging at his clothes, his feet moving wildly as he tore through the underbrush. The howls returned, but thank goodness they were growing fainter as he ran faster and faster, not daring to look back. It felt like he would never get there, but he finally saw the faint glow of the parking area through the trees. He stumbled into the clearing. Amazingly, there was someone else there fiddling with gear in their trunk. They looked at him and smiled, but Ethan couldn't respond. He knew he must have looked crazy, but without stopping, he jumped into his car, started the engine, and tore out of the lot. After about 20 minutes, he did pull over, hoping to shake out the adrenaline. He hadn't gotten a good look at whatever was in those woods, but whatever it was the most terrifying thing he had ever encountered. He had feared for his life, and that's not a feeling everyone can say they've felt. It was also the feeling of being watched, and the sound of those unnatural howls. Needless to say, he has never returned to Shawnee State Forest. Something lived out there, deep in those woods, something that wasn't an animal or a person. Whatever it was, Ethan was sure of one thing. It didn't want him there, and it made that very clear. Luckily, it didn't want him gone, or he wouldn't be here to share his story. So here's to Ethan and his quick thinking that got him out of the woods safe and sound. Stay safe, everyone, and be sure to watch your back, especially when you're alone in the woods. Tom Miller had always been an adventurer at heart. A seasoned mountaineer living in Colorado, he'd climbed some of the world's most challenging peaks, from the Rockies to the Andes. But the Himalayas had always been his ultimate goal. It wasn't just about the climb, it was about the mystery, the allure of the world's highest mountains, filled with legends. And no legend was more famous or more elusive than that of the Yeti. Tom had heard the stories countless times, hairy, man-like creatures spotted by Sherpas and explorers, their enormous footprints discovered in the snow at impossible altitudes. Some dismissed it as myth, but Tom wasn't so sure. Over the years, he'd learned that sometimes the most unbelievable stories had a grain of truth hidden in them. It was the winter of 2024 when Tom finally found himself in Nepal, standing at the base of Mount Makalu, the 5th highest peak in the world. He'd assembled a small, trusted team for the climb, 2 Sherpas, Lakpa and Dorje, and a fellow climber, Sarah, who had as much experience as he did. Their goal was reach the summit while climbing through regions where the Yeti was rumored to roam. The first few days of the climb were uneventful, though grueling. The altitude, the cold, and the constant battle against the elements were enough to keep their minds focused on survival. But as they ascended higher, the landscape began to change. The towering cliffs of ice and snow gave way to vast, wind-swept plateaus, where the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. They reached a remote part of the mountain on the 6th day, setting up camp on a ridge overlooking a deep valley. The view was breathtaking, but the weather had taken a turn for the worse. A blizzard was rolling in, and they knew they had to hunker down and wait it out until it passed. That night, as the wind howled outside their tents, Tom found himself unable to sleep. The temperature had plummeted, and even the thick layers of his sleeping bag didn't seem to be keeping him warm. He lay there, staring at the canvas above him, listening to the sounds of the storm. But amid the howling wind, he was sure he heard something else, a low, rhythmic thumping. Tom sat up, straining to listen. The sound was faint, almost drowned out by the storm, but it was there, steady and deliberate. He glanced over at Sarah, who was still asleep, then quietly unzipped a small portion of his tent and tried to look outside. The wind cut through him like a knife, but he was sure the sound was coming from just outside of camp. He knew it was a terrible idea to go out in the storm, but curiosity got the better of him. He unzipped the tent, the snow immediately stinging his face. He pulled his hood tighter and adjusted his face mask and started towards the ridge, his boots sinking into the deep snow with every step. The sound grew louder as he approached the edge. Tom's pulse quickened as he reached the ridge and looked down into the valley below. At first, he saw just a vast expanse of white, whipped by the wind. But then, in the distance, something moved. A shadow, large and bulky, trudging through the snow, its movements slow but powerful. His mind tried to tell him it was another climber, but he knew that was not at all possible. They were the only team in the area. The light barely penetrated the storm, but it was enough to reveal the shape of something massive. It seemed to be covered in thick, matted fur, its silhouette towering above the snowdrifts. Tom's mind was on high alert. Was this really the Yeti? The creature seemed to pause, as if sensing his presence, and turned its head towards him. That's when he caught a quick glimpse of its face, dark, deep-set eyes, and a mouth that seemed almost human, but with an expression that was anything but. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the snow, the wind howling between them. Tom didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, afraid that any motion would provoke the creature. Then, the Yeti turned and quickly lumbered off into the storm, disappearing into the blizzard as if it had never been there. Tom wanted to follow, to chase after it, but his rational mind knew better. The storm was worsening, and he was already at risk just being out of the tent, and he hadn't even acclimatized properly yet to the altitude. With one last look into the darkness, he turned and made his way back to the tent. When he returned, he found Sarah and the Sherpas awake, their faces pale. "You heard it too?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. "We were terrified it had gotten a hold of you," she managed to say. Tom nodded, unable to find the words to explain. Lakpa and Dorje exchanged a look, their expressions grim. "We must leave," Lakpa said quietly. "This place is not safe. The Yeti does not like to be disturbed." Tom didn't argue. They packed up quickly, their movements hurried, driven by a newfound urgency. Within an hour, they were descending the mountain, the storm at their backs. In the days that followed, Tom found himself going inward. Part of him wanted to believe it had been a hallucination, but the memory of what he had seen was too vivid to dismiss. Back in the nearest village, Tom found himself at a loss for how to explain what had happened. The locals had heard about the encounter. The story had traveled like wildfire. They listened to him, with the Sherpas translating, with knowing expressions, nodding as if they'd heard it all before. But no one seemed to question him. No one doubted his story. Because here in the Himalayas, the Yeti was more than just a myth. It was a reality that everyone accepted, even if they never spoke of it openly. Tom left Nepal with a respect for the mountains that went far beyond the physical challenge. The Himalayas were more than just a place. They were a realm of mystery, a world where ancient legends were still very much believed, a place of magic and mystery. And though he didn't know if he'd ever return, the memory of that night and the encounter with the Yeti would stay with him forever, keeping him well aware that his being is but a small presence within the wonders of the world. In the remote corners of northern Michigan lies an area referred to as Lost Hollow, a place so remote that it doesn't appear on any modern map. Mark Thompson had grown up hearing stories about this forgotten corner of the state. He had heard tales of shadowy figures and strange happenings, but he never took them seriously. However, that all changed completely on one cold November night. Mark had decided to take a break from his desk job and venture into the wilds of Lost Hollow for a weekend adventure. The area was known for its dense forests, uneven terrain, and eerie quiet, all things that were drawing him in for some reason. He had arrived in Lost Hollow a few days earlier, setting up his camp by a secluded stream that twisted through the forest. The days had been filled with hiking and mapping the uncharted trails, and the nights were spent by a fire, with only the sounds of the forest to listen to. Everything seemed peaceful, until the night of November 3rd. The day had been overcast, with clouds rolling in and out and making it hard to see. As night fell, Mark cooked dinner over the fire and settled into his tent. Around midnight, he was jolted awake by an unsettling noise, a series of rhythmic thuds, like something heavy moving through the area. It was deliberate and forceful. Mark lay still, listening. The thuds grew closer, accompanied by a low growl that he could literally feel in the ground below him. His heart began to race. He fumbled for his flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, carefully looking out into the darkness. All around him the forest was still, but the noises continued. The most terrifying part of it all was that the noises were now accompanied by a series of sharp, piercing howls. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the tent, scanning the forest with his flashlight. All he could make out was the silhouettes of trees and the mist rolling in from the stream. But the howls persisted, coming from a direction that seemed to be directly behind him, or maybe it was in front of him, or even beside him. It seemed to keep changing and coming from everywhere all at once. Mark tried to put logic to what was happening, but he couldn't connect the sounds with anything he knew. This sound was different, more guttural, and the rhythmic thuds were strange too. He decided to investigate closer, following the sounds cautiously, his flashlight bobbing as he moved, trying to find the source. As he pushed through the underbrush, he could swear that the air grew colder and the fog thickened, making it nearly impossible to see too far in front of him. The thuds and growls grew louder, more intense, until Mark came to a clearing he didn't remember from his earlier hikes. He was now completely terrified, not knowing what was going on, and barely able to see. In the center of the clearing was a large, ancient oak, its branches twisted and gnarled, casting strange shadows on the ground. It was then that he saw it, a massive figure standing by the oak, partially obscured by the fog. At first, it looked like a bear, but as Mark's flashlight beam fell upon it, he realized it was something far more disturbing because it didn't make sense. The creature was covered in shaggy fur, standing upright on two legs, with a face that was a grotesque blend of canine and human features. Its eyes glowed with a fierce light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. The creature's head turned slowly, its glowing eyes meeting his, and it let out a low, menacing growl. He knew instantly that it was the same sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground earlier. The thuds Mark had heard were the creature's massive claws striking the ground, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pattern. Instinct kicked in, and Mark started to back away, but the creature was too fast. With a burst of movement, it leaped into the air, landing on all fours. It circled the clearing, its movements fluid and unnervingly graceful, as if it was toying with him. Mark tried to keep his distance, backing away slowly. The creature followed, its eyes never leaving his. The howls continued, now a completely confusing sound that seemed to fill the entire clearing. Mark's flashlight flickered, the beam weak and inconsistent, casting erratic shadows that made it hard to see. He stumbled over a fallen log, falling to the ground as the creature let out a triumphant snarl. Mark scrambled to his feet and screamed at the top of his lungs. He didn't know what else to do, and it was his only defense that he could think of. The noise seemed to startle the creature, which paused for a moment before turning and disappearing into the fog. Mark didn't waste any time. He raced back to his camp, the forest around him eerily silent once more. He packed up his gear with trembling hands, every sound amplified by his fear. By the time he had everything together, he barely had any energy left to get himself back to his car, but he pushed on and eventually made it back. He left Lost Hollow behind, driving away with a sense of relief and disbelief. The creature he had encountered was unlike anything he had ever seen, a hybrid of some insane nightmare, a being that belonged to the dark corners that we don't understand. As he drove away, the memories of the night replayed in his mind, each detail as vivid and unsettling as the first moment he saw it. The locals, when he mentioned it to them, only nodded, but they did it slowly and knowingly. They'd heard similar stories before, but few talked about it much, mostly keeping the horror to themselves. But Mark knew he couldn't do the same, and so he decided to share his horrifying experience with us, hoping we can help him to understand, and maybe even help him get past it all. Do any of you have any thoughts that can help him?